First off, I want to say how very much I appreciate in the prayer that was uttered earlier, thanking God for the meeting that Sue and I were involved with, as well as Mo and Judy. We appreciate that. I know how very important prayer is, and I appreciate your prayers for us. I enjoyed my time up at Valparaiso with the Vale Church up there, working with that congregation, but it is always just a blessing and very good to be back home. I just appreciate this congregation more than I can possibly tell you. For those of you who filled in and picked up the slack that I left when I went to Vale, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your willingness to do what you can in the service of God. I just think we just got a ton of talent and ability here in this congregation, and I know we're certainly blessed. I want to go back to the passage that Bo read, at least a couple of verses out of that passage in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. Jesus said this, He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. That you also love one another, and by this all will know that you're my disciples, if you have love for one another." Now, when you read that, I think we come away concluding, man, that's great what the Lord said. That's a fantastic statement that the Lord has made there. But let me ask you, now, by the way, I want you to notice that Jesus said this is a commandment. This is a commandment that I give to you. You know, sometimes we think that since we live under the gospel grace, or the gospel of grace, or the grace dispensation, that somehow commandments are not there. They're not part of it. But hey, Jesus said this was a commandment. But let me ask you something. Even though we look at that as a commandment, we see how great that it is, how fantastic a commandment that it really is. Is it something that we do? Is it something that we can do? Is it something that is even possible for us to do today, as it was at the time that Jesus gave that commandment? You know, there are people who say, well, you know what, I tell you what, I love mankind. It's people I don't like. And I think sometimes that's the attitude that people have. You know, I love everybody, but I don't like that person. Or I love everybody, but I don't like her. And so when we have an attitude like that, in reality, we're disobeying that commandment. And by the way, before I get into that, let me tell you what I read, what I heard one time. I heard one time that a little boy was hearing some folks talk about Christians. And he and his family, they didn't go to church anywhere, so he comes home and he asked his dad, said, "Dad, what are Christians?" And Dad, you know, he began to scratch his head a little bit. He said, "Well, I think Christians are, they're those people who believe in God, and they're those people that, they go to church, and they're those people who, well, you know, I understand they pay their taxes and things like this, and I understand that Christians, well, they don't tell lies, and they don't smoke, and they don't drink." And he goes through this little litany of things, you know, and the little boy's in there scratching his head, and he said, "Well, tell me, Dad, have I ever seen one?" And when I heard that, or when I read that, you know, I got to thinking, well, when you look at what Jesus said here, insofar as this commandment is concerned, Jesus said, "I'm going to tell you how people can know when they see a Christian." And he said, you know, love one another. He said, by this, by what? By this love that you have for one another, people will know that you are Christians. People will know that you are my disciples by this. And, you know, you can't cut that any other way than that. And this is something, by the way, that Satan cannot duplicate. Do you know Satan cannot duplicate the love that Christians are to have one for another? Tertullian, who was an historian from Carthage many centuries ago, said this, "See how those Christians love one another." Now, pardon me, now in the last discourse that Jesus gives before he is betrayed and crucified, in that last discourse, Jesus said, "I'm giving you this commandment. I am commanding that you love one another." He says, by the way, this is a new commandment, that you love one another.
But let me ask you something. How can that be a new commandment when we already throughout the Scriptures find that people are told to love one another? You go back to the Old Testament. You go back to the book of Leviticus in chapter 19, verses 18 and 34. Twice in that chapter, God says, love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that's what God said back in the Old Testament. And then when we get to the New, we find that in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and verse 43, Jesus quoting from Leviticus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And throughout the Gospels, Matthew 19 and verse 19, when the rich young ruler was questioning Jesus, Jesus said, keep the commandments. He said, I have. I've kept these commandments. Well, one of the commandments that Jesus says is love your neighbor as yourself. And then in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 and 38, when Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus said, well, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So my question to you is, how can this be a new commandment when it's obviously an old commandment? I don't know about you, but there are things like that that sort of interest me when I read the Bible. I don't think there's a contradiction here, not one bit. But I think this is interesting. Jesus said, a new commandment that I give you. Well, let me tell you what's new about that. What's new about it is the way that Jesus described the love that we're to have, one for another. Jesus said, I want you to love each other as I have loved you. Now, I'm going to return to that in just a moment. But let me say to you that this commandment to love one another, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very frank with you. This is not an anomaly. This is not an oddity. John chapter 13 and verse 34 is not an oddity. This is something that is said throughout the Gospels. It's something that's said throughout the New Testament. And I'm just putting some verses up here to let you know every place in your New Testament where it tells you and me as Christians to love one another. In all of these passages, you can look them up. You can mark them down and look them up and read them. And in every one of these passages, God calls upon us in command form to love one another. Now, it's as simple as that. And by the way, you count those passages and you see how many they are. And let me tell you, we understand that when we are to worship God with music, that music that God has authorized is to sing. You know that. I know that. And there's no way in the world that we would, loving God, seek to get away from that. But do you know there are only 8 passages in your New Testament that talks about singing? And there are this many passages that talk about love. And the love that we're to have one for another. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 reminds us in verse 13 that the greatest that there is love. He talks about faith, and he talks about hope, and he talks about love. And Paul says, you know what? Of faith, hope, and love, he said the greatest of these is love. And he starts out that chapter by saying this. Listen to it. He says, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I have become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. He said, it doesn't make any difference what I do. It doesn't make any difference how religious I am. It doesn't make any difference how often I go to church. It doesn't make any difference how many classes I teach, how many testimonies that I give about my faith, if you want to use that term. It makes no difference. If I have not love, he said, I'm just making a bunch of noise. He said, although I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, he said, I am nothing. I am a fraud, and I am a phony, and I am a hypocrite. He said, and though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, he said, it profits me nothing. This is how important love is. Now, let me tell you, that love that we're talking about here, that love that we're reading about in 1 Corinthians, that love that we're reading about in John chapter 13, 34 and 35, translates, and you know it as well as do I, the Greek word agape. And agape is a different kind of love. It's not an emotional attachment that one may have for another. It's not the love that would exist between a husband and a wife. That's eros. Now, a husband is to love his wife, agape, but that goes into a different area. It's not the love that we would have for our children. That love is storge in the Greek. That's a natural affection that we might have. It's not the love that we would have for a sibling. That's phileo or Philadelphia. That's a brotherly love. That's an emotional love. Agape love means undefeatable goodwill. And what it means is to have a preference for. If I love another, then I give preference to the one that I love, to wish well, to regard the welfare of. Now the King James Version, more often than not, translates the Greek word agape into the English word charity. And I think that's an excellent translation, actually. Because the word agape is a word that does describe benevolence. We can extend charity to somebody that we have no emotional attachment to. And that's the way that it is with agape. We can agape, or we can Christian love someone that there is no necessary attachment to. Emotional, that is. John says this in 1 John chapter 3. And this kind of helps us to understand that agape is a doing kind of love. It is an investing in others kind of love. He said, whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? Great question. He said, my little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. So what John is saying here, he's describing agape love in a very practical way. He says you love by what you do and by how you invest in the well-being of another person. He said in chapter 4 and verse 20 of the same book, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? And this commandment we have from him, that he's going back to John 13. And this commandment we have from him, that he who loves God must love his brother also. Paul said in Romans chapter 12 and verse 20, this love is so profound that it's to be extended to one's enemy. And he describes it this way. He said, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. But I don't have an emotional attachment to him. Paul didn't say that. He said, if your enemy is thirsty, give him drink. But I don't feel close to him. That's not the point. The point is that this is the way that we love our enemy. And Jesus said the same, did he not? Matthew 5 and verse 44. It is investing in what is good for him. Now I want to return. I said I was going to come back to this. I want to return to what Jesus said. You love one another as I loved you. And what I want to do is look at 4 things about the love of Jesus and how that is applicable in the community of Christians. That we're to love one another as Jesus loved us. And like I said, we're going to break this down into 4 points. Love one another as I have loved you, Jesus said in John 13 and verse 34. Well, how did Jesus love? Well, in the first place, we find that Jesus' love was a selfless love. Jesus loved us selflessly. Now let me tell you what I'm talking about here. When you look at the life of Jesus, and of course his early death at the age of 33 years old, you understand that the love that Jesus had for humanity was selfless. He invested himself, both in his life and his death, in others. He never considered himself. Isn't this what Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2? When he says, have this mind in you, which was in Christ Jesus, who existing in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. He laid the Bible says that He emptied Himself. He emptied Himself and took on the form of a servant. He took on the form of a man. Now, Jesus did not divest Himself of His divinity, but He emptied Himself. He surrendered to the needs of others. Jesus loved us selflessly. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28, that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. And do what? And to give His life a ransom for many. Just think about it. Jesus was often hungry, and yet He fed the hungry. Jesus, everything that Jesus did, He did the work of a slave. Everything Jesus did, He did for others. It wasn't about Him. I want you to consider something. Going back to John chapter 13. You ever notice how the chapter begins? John 13 and verse 1 begins this way. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that His hour had come, that He should depart from the world to the Father, listen, having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end. Now let me show you how this plays out in this upper room where Jesus is. Jesus tells the disciples, go find this upper room. We're going to observe the feast of the Passover. Now you and I know that a custom of the Jews was, whenever you went to someone's home, you went to a place such as they went to in the upper room, somebody, usually a slave or a servant, is there to do what? To wash the guest's feet. There would be a basin of water provided. There would be a towel provided so that a slave could wash the guest's feet. Well, here is Jesus and these 12 apostles of His in an upper room. And guess what? Not one of those men head for the wash basin. Not one of them. They don't go over. Peter, I'm not about to wash any feet. John, I'm not about to wash any feet. Jesus loved His disciples and He loved them to the end. And who was it that girded himself with a towel and washed the dirty feet of those men? Verse 4 says that Jesus rose from supper and laid aside His garments, took a towel and girded Himself. After that He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wiped them with the towel with which He was girded. Now, I want to say, here it is. Just a contrast here. Here it is, the disciples, it's about this time that they're arguing over who's the greatest, and it's the disciples who demand a throne, and yet it's Jesus who reaches for a towel. Now anybody in the church who is demanding a throne rather than reaching for a towel doesn't love selflessly as Jesus did. Love one another selflessly is the way that Jesus loved. Romans 13 and verse 10, love does no harm. Love does no harm to his neighbor. That's pretty commonsensical, is it not? If I love my neighbor, then I tell you what, I'm not going to covet what my neighbor has. I love my neighbor. I'm not going to covet his wife. I'm not going to covet his things. I'm not going to covet his success. I love him. And this is how Jesus loved. Jesus loved selflessly. Now, to put that in practical terms, am I willing to give up my opinion for you? Or do I have to demand my way? Am I willing to empty myself in order to provide for you? If I'm not, then I tell you what, if I'm always demanding to be first, then I'm not loving selflessly like Jesus did. Am I willing to go the extra mile? To help out someone, or to serve someone, or to help out some of these young people? Are we willing to go the extra mile to help and encourage and love? This is the kind of love that Jesus had. It was a selfless love. And I tell you what, if I have a love for others, then there's certain things that I won't do. Now, there's certain things that I will do, and we've already looked at that, but there's certain things that I will never do. I will never gossip about. I will never slander. I will never malign another, even if it's true. You know, in the context here, in the context of what's going on here in John 13, did you ever notice in verse 27? Now, after the piece of bread, Satan entered into him, that is, into Judas, and Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." But no one, listen, this is important here. No one at the table knew for what reason he said this to him. Here is a man that's going out to betray Jesus, and Jesus didn't say to these apostles, "Listen, let me tell you something. Judas is a devil, and he's going out to do the devil's work." He didn't tell the disciples, "This is what Judas is fixing to do." He didn't say that. He could have, but he did not. He didn't say, "Well, I'll tell you what, Judas is a bum, Judas is a hypocrite." No, Jesus even washed the feet of Judas that was going to carry him to betray the Lord. Families would heal, and churches would unite if we just learn to love one another selflessly. This is what Paul calls in Colossians 2 and verse 14, the bond that is the adhesive, the cement, the bond of perfection. It pulls people together when love is selfless. But as we continue to think about the love of Jesus and that which we are to emulate, his love was selfless. The love of Jesus was also sacrificial. He loved us sacrificially. We know the extent of that, do we not? You know, when we talk about the love of Jesus, we recognize that the love of Jesus was spelled with a cross. The love of Jesus is spelled Calvary. John 15 and verse 12. "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." This is what this is what John repeated over in 1 John chapter 3. And by the way, you know, 1 John 3 and verse 16 is as rich in its depth of information as John 3:16. 1 John 3:16 says, "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us." Oh, and guess what? And we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That is a sacrificial love. But let me tell you something about sacrificial love. Sacrificial love is impossible to give and to offer and to bear until we begin to value the worth of the other person. So long as we don't value the worth of an individual, we will never be able to love that person sacrificially. We've got to value that person. You know, I was talking to somebody very recently about the ability that the military has to really, I don't want to use the term brainwash, but it's almost a brainwashing. The ability that the military has to dehumanize those that are considered to be enemies. When I was drafted into the Army in the late 1960s, here's a 19-year-old kid from Louisville, Kentucky, and in 8 weeks' time, the Army had convinced me, and I believe that I could have done it without flinching. The Army had convinced me that everybody who lived in Vietnam that was a Vietnamese guerrilla or North Vietnamese Army was a gook and was nothing but a cockroach and nothing but a rat. And when you take them out, it's just like stepping on a cockroach or catching a rat. They dehumanize. There's no value in those people's lives. And so what do we do? Well, if they're not valuable, I'll just take them out. They're not worth anything. In order for me to love sacrificially, I've got to look beyond what maybe is visual, and I've got to see that here is someone who is made in the image of God. Here is someone who is very precious to God. And so as a result of that, that person is going to be very precious to me. I'm going to love him. I'm going to love her. That person is valuable, and I'll sacrifice for that person. You know, in John 3:16, we mentioned that a moment ago in reference to 1 John 3:16. You know, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. Let me tell you something. Oh, and by the way, in John 3, Jesus is talking about the new birth, you know, in verses 3 and 5, being born again. Then He talks about the love of God. Do you know Peter weds those two concepts together? He brings them together, actually. In 1 Peter, the apostle is talking about becoming Christians. And he says in verse 19 of 1 Peter 1, but you know what? You've been redeemed by the precious blood of Christ. And Christ was foreordained before the world began for this. Then he says this in verse 22. Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth. And by the way, he points out that this is being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible. But that's what he calls it. But here's what he says. You've obeyed the truth through the Spirit in sincere love of the brethren. Love one another fervently. Do you notice how he blends this idea? When I become a Christian, I'm responding to God's love because God considers me to be very valuable. And so therefore I am to extend that love to God's people because they too are valuable, both to God and they're to be valuable to me. Christian love is not about lust and sentimentality and gratification. You know, I try to tell young people that if you have somebody that tells you in a relationship, if you love me, you will. No. What they're saying is, you're not valuable to me, I'm valuable to me. Love is valuing the other person because you see the worth in that person. Love never seeks anything except what's best for the object of that person's love. In Seattle, Washington, a number of years ago, there was an Olympic event being held. And it was going to be this 100-yard dash in this Olympic event. And there were the runners lined up, ready for the starting gun. Oh, and this 100-yard dash included both boys and girls that were going to run in this event. The gun sounded. The runners took off. And they were running down the track and they were giggling and, you know, just enjoying themselves. Oh, did I tell you? This was the Special Olympics. These were children with learning disabilities. These were children that we would often refer to as handicapped. Most of them in this 100-yard dash were Down's children. One little boy fell and he started crying. All the other runners stopped, went back and picked him up, and they all joined arms and walked across the finish line together. What I read was that the crowd went wild. Standing ovation that lasted for minutes. And then someone made the observation, you know, we have just witnessed agape love in action. I think that's true. That's what love is. They valued that little fellow more than they valued coming across the finish line first. That's sacrificial love. Sacrificial love is just like the love that the prodigal's father had for his son when he come home. That boy had shamed his mother and father. And how outrageous is it to open-armed embrace a returning rebel? Well, that's shameless. Yes, it is. But that's what agape love is. It is shameless. Because it's the love that God had for lost humanity. Jesus said, you love one another like I love you. He loved selflessly. He loved sacrificially. And He loved understandingly. Did you ever stop and consider that? When remember John 13 and verse 1? Jesus loved His disciples to the end. Jesus loved them through and through. Wait a minute, Jesus. You love the disciples to the end. You love them through and through. Wait a minute. There's Peter who's going to deny you 3 times. I love him. Well, you've got to understand. Jesus even said to Peter one time, Satan is wanting to sift you. Luke 22. And you know what, Peter? I'm praying for you, but the devil's going to get you. But when you return to me, then you strengthen the brethren. I tell people, what that tells me is that even though Jesus said all of my disciples are going to forsake me, all of them are going to flee. Jesus loved those disciples, warts and all. He knew their strengths. He knew their weaknesses. He knew their flaws. He knew their imperfections. But Jesus said, I love them anyway. They're going to blow it on the night of my betrayal, but you know what? I'm going to stick with them, and I love them anyway. Now, I'm not talking about compromise. Jesus didn't compromise with sin in any kind of way, and we're not to compromise with sin in any kind of way. Well, what this means is, you ever notice how when somebody does something to someone, maybe it's inadvertent, or maybe it's in a moment of weakness or whatever, and you can never get back on that person's good side? You know what that says? They are not loving me with understanding. Are you perfect? Do you live with perfection? Then how can I, if I don't live with perfection, how can I have somebody do something to me or against me and suddenly never be able to work that out? Parents are that way sometimes. Parents sometimes, and I don't think they set out to be this way, but sometimes they don't know how to handle a situation. A child will do something such as the prodigal we mentioned a moment ago and bring shame upon the family. The family never gets over it. Jesus loved these disciples even though some of them betrayed Him. Yes, they came back. Even though they forsook Him and fled, yes, they came back. But what if the Lord would say, hey, you guys blew it. I'm done with you. I'm through with you. I'm not going to have anything to do with you anymore. Just die and go to hell if that's what you want to do. No, Jesus didn't do that. You read John 21, the restoration of the Apostle Peter, and all you can read in that chapter is an understanding love that Jesus had for Peter. He didn't condone what Peter did. What Peter did was no different than what Judas did. But Peter came back. And when he came back, he was restored to the Lord. He was restored to his brethren. Strengthen the brethren, Jesus said. And when we love in an understanding kind of way, I got to tell you, that makes us vulnerable. If you love somebody, you're very vulnerable. All of your vulnerabilities are laid out there for somebody to just step on. Just walk all over. Jesus loved these disciples and they walked all over Him. They denied Him. Peter even cursed and said, I don't know. Peter went from confessing Him to be the Christ, the Son of God, to confessing Him to be the man I don't know. And it just makes us, Jesus in John 1 and verse 11, Jesus came to His own and His own received Him not. How would you like that? How would you like to go away a week on a business trip and you come home and you walk in the door and your husband or your wife says, who in the world are you? Get out of my house. I don't know you. I'm going to call the police if you're not out of here. They said that's the way it was with Jesus. Jesus went to His own received Him not. We don't know you. We don't love you. We don't care anything about you. But Jesus loved His own to the end. I think that's the tragedy of Alzheimer's. To just see someone not be able to receive me. who has known me and who has shared love with me throughout the years, now say, I don't even know who you are. But that's the way sometimes love is. Love makes us vulnerable. Paul was rejected like Christ was, even by the very brethren that he taught the truth to. He said to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 15, the more abundantly I love you, the less I am loved by you. That's the way love is. Love makes us vulnerable, and that's the reason some people shy away from it. But Paul said in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, he said, hey, walk in love. That's the environment in which we live. And if you're loving as Christ loved, you don't turn it on and off. I love today, but I won't tomorrow. I love tomorrow, but I won't the next day. This is not the way that we walk in love. That describes the environment of a Christian, that environment in which we live. It forms our personality. We love at church. We love at home. We love on the road. We love in the neighborhood. We love on Facebook. We love on Instagram. We love because that describes us. So the love of Christ is not only selfless, not only sacrificial, not only understandingly, but finally the love of Christ is a love that is forgiving. And we are to love like Christ, and we are to love forgivingly. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Jesus said as he was dying on the cross. And I'm going to tell you something. When we learn to love forgivingly, we won't hold grudges. Jesus didn't hold a grudge with Peter. Again, read John 21, the restoration of Peter. The father of the prodigal didn't hold a grudge. Now, the older brother did. Luke 15, verse 28. He held a grudge. He wouldn't go in. Things are never going to be all right with us. But the father certainly did not hold a grudge. The love that we're to have for one another is a forgiving love. Somebody said, well, I can't. Okay. You can't. No, I can't. I just can't do it. Okay. Know this. If you can't, know this. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 and verses 14 and 15 that you will not be forgiven by God. Now just know that. Hate, unforgiveness. I often tell people it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other fellow to die. All it does is kill us. The act of Jesus on the cross was an act of forgiving love. It cost the life of Jesus. And it can sometimes cost us. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples. If you what? By this, all men will know you are my disciple if you come from a family of Christians. That's not what it says, is it? By this, all men will know you are my disciples if you attend worship without fail. Now, those two are important things. That's not what he says, is it? By this, all men will know you're my disciples if you teach Bible classes. Again, that's important. We need teachers. But that's not what he said, is it? By this, all men will know you're my disciples if you worship without using instruments of music. That too is important. That doesn't identify us as disciples of Christ. By this, all men will know you're my disciples if you oppose all manner of false doctrines, if you preach and serve as an elder or a deacon. People will know that you're my disciple. No, those are important things. But that's not the identifiable mark that Jesus said all men will recognize. By this, all men will recognize you are my disciple if you have love for one another. That's the identifying feature. Love one another as I have loved you. You know, one thing I learned a long time ago, that when you talk about subjects like this, talk about love, either people sometimes want to pigeonhole you and think, well, you know what, you can preach that in any denomination that there is. Well, that may be true. Or people kind of get bored, go to sleep. Well, I've heard all that all my life. What I want to leave you with is just what's on the board right here. This is an identifying mark. It ought to be identifying the Danville Church as being a community of Christians. It ought to identify my family as being a community of Christians. It's what I've told my family. And I'll continue to tell them for as long as I live. This is what's going to identify us as Christians, that we have love for one another. Now, if you love the Lord, Jesus said you will obey Him. You believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. You're willing to repent of your sins, turn from them, confess your faith in Him as the Messiah, as the Lord of your life, that He died for you, and be baptized in water for the remission of your sins. You can be raised to walk in newness of life. Don't you want to be a Christian? Don't you want to join a community that loves one another? If you do, why don't you obey the Lord right now as together we stand and as we sing?